July 1st, 1965, Valensole, France. It was approximately 6 in the morning when Maurice Masse was getting ready for work on his farm. Suddenly, he heard a strange noise coming from his lavender field. Masse assumed it was one of the military helicopters that would occasionally land on his property. Worried that the helicopter might be crushing his lavender, he made his way over to the field and intended to tell the pilot to park someplace else. But rather than a helicopter, Masse stumbled upon an egg-shaped vehicle about the size of an automobile. It stood on 6 thin legs, sitting about 200 feet away from him. He noticed 2 small boys, about 4 feet tall, standing near the craft, apparently observing the lavender. As Masse began to walk closer to confront these boys, he realized they weren't boys at all. They weren't even human. Dressed in green one-piece suits, these creatures had abnormally large and bald heads, no lips, pointed chins, pale skin, and small hands. One of the creatures suddenly turned around and pointed a small tube at Masse, blasting him with a light that paralyzed him. These creatures stared at Masse for about a minute, communicating with one another by low, guttural grunts. A door then slid open across the craft, and the 2 mysterious creatures disappeared into it. After the door closed, the craft took off into the sky and out of Masse's sight. Masse was paralyzed for about 15 minutes before he could even begin to move. After checking to inspect the marks the craft's legs had made on his lavender, he rushed to town and told a cafe owner what had happened. It wasn't long before the story hit the media, and authorities and Masse's farm soon became infested with tourists. UFO investigators took samples of the lavender and soil allegedly touched by the craft, and Masse freely talked to them about his experience. Investigators found that the ground where the craft had landed was soaked with moisture, although no rain had fallen. Geometrically spaced indentations covered the area, and the plants were affected by the proximity of the phenomenon, appearing to decay in direct proportion to their distance from the central column of the craft. The calcium content of the soil at the landing site was found to be much higher than in samples taken from other areas in the field. The case caught the attention of noted UFO researcher and astronomer Dr. Jacques Vallée.
And all of a sudden he was paralyzed. He saw 2 small creatures. They were not quite the ones that you have here. They were very small, but they had normal heads and they had normal human features. But he was paralyzed, and they started speaking to each other in some strange language, went back into the object took off. The interesting thing is that there were traces left. Those traces were studied by various agencies of the French government. There was no question he was not lying. The traces could not be duplicated. And he was paralyzed for 20 minutes after the object left, which is very interesting from the point of view of the effect of the kind of radiation that object may have been creating. And this is a very common report on the part of witnesses of this feeling of paralysis.
Vallée returned to the scene of the incident in 1979, and meeting with Maurice Masse and 2 of his close friends, made a number of interesting observations. Vallée noted that Masse was reluctant to give all the details of his experience to investigators, as well as to his own family at the time, including the fact that he believed that some type of silent communication took place between himself and these creatures. From the beginning, he wanted to minimize the impact of the experience, not wanting publicity, amongst other reasons. Like many experiencers of this phenomenon, he had changed in many ways as a result of the experience, including the belief that some form of contact, once established, continued in subtle forms. Vallée concluded that, quote, "Throughout this discussion with Mr. Masse, I had the feeling that I was in the presence of a very intelligent man, capable of deep emotions and rational thought. He is also quite humble. He has declined to appear on a television documentary with a nationally known journalist. I had brought with me a photograph of similar traces left after another case. Mr. Masse looked at me with a mixture of amazement and relief that someone else was aware of these particular marks. He told us that he sometimes found them in his field. That's how he knows that they have come back. He always erases the traces immediately. Reflecting back on this experience, Masse said that he wasn't afraid at all during the encounter and believed that the creatures had no desire to hurt him. Masse did, however, refuse to elaborate on the psychological and physical effects he felt afterward. He did admit to feeling extremely sleepy during the first few weeks, sometimes sleeping up to 12 hours a day. In particular, there was one big detail of the encounter that he refused to discuss with anybody. He was quoted as saying, "Nobody will make me tell it." His wife later said in an interview that he constantly thought about the creatures and, quote, considered his encounter with them a spiritual experience. Whatever else he saw or heard or experienced, Masse would take to the grave with him, dying on May 14th, 2004. And with that, we will never truly know the one detail of the encounter he refused to share with the public. And this enduring mystery of the encounter in the lavender field may forever remain unexplained.